Welcome, everybody. Just to make sure you're aware, this webinar is being recorded. And so we'll get it posted on the Thai website later on today or tomorrow. But I'm super excited to have all of you attending this Lunch and Learn. It's certainly a timely topic, not only, how to manage a hybrid or fully remote workforce, but also as an entrepreneur, how can you take advantage of the fact that so many companies are now managing hybrid or remote workforces, and what can you do to help support them? So again, welcome. We have a stellar panel here that is going to share their experiences working with both hybrid and remote workforces. And Ernie here is going to be our moderator. But before we get started, I always like to thank our sponsors. So especially I'd like to thank Buchalter, who has continued to provide the leadership and sponsorship for our Lunch and Learns. And hopefully we can get in-person pub talks starting again later this spring. But many thanks to Buchalter. And I'd also like to thank other organizations that provide additional support for my work as a venture catalyst. So that's Washington County, the City of Hillsborough, City of Forest Grove, Oregon Community Foundation, as well as Thai Oregon. So many thanks to all of these sponsors. And for those of you who don't know me, again, my name is Laura Kubishek, and I'm the venture catalyst for Washington County. And what that means is I meet one-on-one with entrepreneurs here on the West Side. I'll discuss their business plans. I'll provide coach and mentoring, but I'm also a connector. So I'll connect the entrepreneurs to additional resources, and that could be people, programs, or capital, just to help their businesses thrive. And in addition to meeting with entrepreneurs, I also put on these educational programs. I put my email address in the chat room. So if you'd like to reach out to me or schedule a meeting, always feel free to do that. Or if you have ideas for future Lunch and Learns, I always love to hear that as well. So before we get started, I thought I'd just quickly go through the agenda, and then I'm going to pass it over to Ernie. But what we'll do is we'll have each of our speakers provide a little background as their introduction, as well as, share some highlights of the topics they plan to discuss. And then Ernie's going to moderate a discussion across all the speakers. I'll be monitoring the chat room. So if you have any questions for anybody on the panel, please feel free to just put that in the chat room, and I'll pop in and ask the questions. But also I want to let you know that we've extended this Lunch and Learn until 1:15, because we know that it's a topic of keen interest to many people, and we want to make sure that we address all your questions. So again, without further ado, let me welcome everyone and pass the baton over to Ernie.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. And I'll introduce myself. Just if you don't know me, I'm Ernie Bootsma. I'm a shareholder with Buchalter, and Buchalter is a law firm that has a presence all across the West Coast in 10 different cities now, with our most recent office opening in Salt Lake 2 weeks ago. And we work with all number of businesses, and I've been working in the area of startups and early stage companies for over 30 years. Here in the Portland area. So we have a great panel today. I want to introduce Robin Jones, Jennifer Reagan, and Tony Bitseth, my colleague from Buchalter, to talk about this remote working. And I think what we're going to do is I'm going to have each one of them talk for a few minutes to introduce themselves, a little more about themselves and their background as it relates to the topic. And then once they've each been introduced, what we'll do is we'll try to go into more of a dialogue conversation as a panel and talk about these issues, as Laura said, until a little after 1. And so if you have questions, again, we'll be watching for those as well. So maybe we'll start with you, Tony. Why don't you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe kind of kick the topics off. Oh, you're on mute.
Hello, everybody. Good to virtually meet you, and I look forward to your questions. I am an attorney at Buchalter, and I've been at Buchalter for about 4 years. Unlike Ernie, I have a little bit different background in that before joining Buchalter, I worked largely with large multinational corporations and very large organizations, which has been an interesting transition because Buchalter has a lot of mid-level and small clients, some very large organizations, but a lot more of a small entrepreneur or companies that are going through their first rounds of financing, or maybe their next rounds of financing after that. And this has been an interesting experience for me, because what I'm finding is with a move toward a virtual workplace and with the globalization, companies are facing the same concerns that larger companies previously faced at a different stage, at an earlier stage in their development. So what we saw maybe in the 90s and even in the aughts would be companies which would largely be self-contained in one geographic location. And as they grew into a larger location, and they had to consider other laws and other issues and how to work as an organization in a larger scale. And that was part of their growth problem. But they already had a track record, they already had an infrastructure. Now we're seeing companies very early on actually needing to reach across that. And so I see that as a challenge, but in a way it's also a real opportunity, because if you can lay the foundation early, it creates less growing pains as you get larger. You've already got an infrastructure that works on a larger basis. So it really helps in scaling. So my focus is compensation. I'm a compensation attorney. And that means that I'm looking at how do you compensate your employees or independent contractors or even K1 partners, because there's many different ways you can bring a workforce together, not just employment. There's other mechanisms. What's the difference between those? How do you choose which is most suitable for your business and creates the least amount of structural hurdles for you? And then how do you get over the structural hurdles? Because federally, we have one set of laws, but workplace laws are largely local and state. And so if you're going to work outside of one particular locale, you need to understand what the restrictions and what the ramifications of that are and what you need to do. And so for employees, for instance, most states you need to register with the state employment department, and there will likely be payroll taxes involved, and you'll need to remit quarterly or monthly, depending on the size of your business, sometimes annually. But you also need to consider whether you're doing enough in a location to be doing business in that location. And if you're doing business in that location, then the level of state and local regulation might be a lot higher, and you might need a business license, and you might end up paying taxes that you may not be familiar with. For instance, in Washington, there's a B&O tax. The B&O tax is a gross tax on gross profits. So you could be running a loss and actually paying tax if you're doing business in Washington state, so that you fall under that tax law. So looking at state and local law and understanding what those requirements are. And they can often involve not just taxation and licensure, but also, are you complying with workers' compensation law in the particular area? Because even if you don't have a workplace, if employees are working from home, workers' compensation applies in most instances. And so knowing that you have that in place is important, because the penalties are very high when you don't have proper workers' compensation insurance in place. And then other types of benefits can be a little bit of a surprise. So if anybody's ever done business in San Francisco has a San Francisco Healthcare Security Ordinance. And that ordinance has a pretty high kind of pay or play rule that says you have to pay a lot per person for medical insurance, or you have to pay that over to the city. So knowing that those things exist in Seattle, we have new legislation that creates a number of sick leave policies that apply to workers. And we also have an executive tax that applies actually to any earnings if somebody resides or works in the Seattle area. So there's a lot of state and local issues that also need to be addressed, without forgetting about the bigger national issues that are going to apply, like you'll have state based rules on wage and hour, including minimum wage requirements that might differ really radically from the federal requirements. And you have Affordable Care Act requirements that may vary dramatically from the particular state rules, particularly when it comes to insurance. And you also have OSHA requirements, and OSHA is actually implemented on a state level as well as the federal level in many states, Oregon and Washington being among them. So you have to consider not just what the federal government is saying, but you have to consider what each locality is saying when it comes to those particular rules. And so it's challenging, but once you get through that and you decide the best structure, it's a good platform for growth, because you're no longer just confined to where you started. You have the ability to expand. And so it's a little bit of roadblock, a little bit of planning, maybe a lot of planning, but it's a huge amount of opportunity.
Thank you, Tony. I think that's a great way to kick it off, because I think it addresses a lot of the issues that we're probably going to be talking about from different angles, from the company perspective, from legal perspective. So now we'll move on to Jennifer. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and maybe kick off some topics that you'd like to introduce today?
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to follow Tony. I love sharing stages with passionate people. I self-identify as passionate myself. So my name is Jennifer. I go by Jen. I'm actually a Willamette University alum, which might not be too impressive when you're in the Northwest, but I live in Los Angeles and I'm based in Santa Monica. So if there's an audience who understands where Willamette is and won't mind me celebrating that, I always celebrate that. And I got my start, my first job was actually with the Oregon League of Conservation Voters, based out of Portland, working on Marion County's, you know what OLCV is because you guys are there. But anyway, so my passion has long been decision making, and how do we give decision makers the information they need to make the best decisions. And I started my career by focusing on decision making from the lens of sustainability. So I supported multinational entertainment companies that own AEG. You might know them because they had a contract with the Rose Garden and the Portland Trail Blazers at one point to help manage that arena. And I helped build their global sustainability program, which was a lot of working with decision makers to help them understand how to adapt change in a high risk environment. High risk meaning you're working with brands that have a huge public image and a low tolerance for trying new things that could jeopardize the fan experience. And so working in that environment, I became really adept at how to work with decision makers to get them to adopt change. I went beyond sustainability into IT and many different process improvement projects, and really found my heart is with the people and how people experience their work life. So I became obsessed with facilitation, diversity and inclusion, culture of belonging. And so I'm very lucky, have an entrepreneurial spirit, spent 9 years in corporate America, and then went out on my own and recently co-founded Morpheus XR, which is the company I'm speaking with you today. Me and my fellow co-founders are all people who found ourselves working remotely or distributed with teams. And during COVID, we found that we had been overly reliant on in-person team building. So even though we had been remote already, we were relying on getting together once a year or choosing to meet up at retreats or conferences to really shepherd our relationship building. And COVID took that away from us and had us really look at what do we do to build connection. So like I said, it's been a passion of mine my whole career, is looking at how decision makers get the information they need to make change. And really the change I had been wanting to see is a change in how we spend our time at work. And just for you all kind of know this, but we adults spend 96% of their waking hours at their work. That's just, that's a fact in the United States. And so if you are going to spend that much of your time contributing to society through work, it would be great to feel like you're valued and that you belong, and that time is giving back to you as much as you're giving to it. And so that's been my passion, and where it applies to what we're talking about today is how has COVID changed culture and what we do to build culture. And just like me and my co-founders at Morpheus found, we were overly relying on physical solutions. And what happens is that allows us to hide and not do the real work to get to know each other. And I'm speaking in layman's terms. So we could hide behind in-person retreats or between the day-to-day interactions we might have when we're in the same physical space. And you might like question, why am I saying the word hiding? But we overly rely on kismet or connection based on location. So, oh, we were both at the water cooler. Oh, we both saw this movie. Oh, we both were at the, we find these things to connect with each other. And that's where a lot of our culture comes from. Happy hours, luncheons, times that we can just connect as humans. And if you don't have those, you have to be very intentional about creating those opportunities to connect as humans throughout your work experience. And so the core concepts of culture and how we build culture are the same pre and post pandemic. The difference is we have less distractions, and because work is now in our home, I think it's causing us to ask ourselves questions really about how we spend productive time, and the value of non-productive time, meaning time spent in conversation, time spent in relationship building, time spent in reflection, not just time constantly working or billable hours. And that pressure and that reveal has given us a lot of opportunities. So I know Robin has some great examples. I don't want to jump too far into giving some specifics. And what I really want to, in our time together, I have a lot of I think are very good specific examples of things you can intentionally create with your teams to build culture. I see here that Bruce wrote in the questions about being interested in how to retain and attract talent. And in the past, a lot of people heard about companies like Google, right? They're attracting and retaining talent because they have these sexy like cafeterias and company time policies. A lot of those were physical. And when you have free time policies, but everyone works from home, it doesn't really translate. What's actually needed is less free time and more structure. And so the core concepts around building culture really come to fostering a sense of belonging and accepting people where they are and meeting them where they are. And so when we talk about fostering a sense of belonging, the core concept behind that is psychological safety, which is that people feel free to take risks, free to make mistakes, and free to express themselves. And this might sound very high level and kind of not tangible, but there are incredibly specific and tangible ways to create this within a team. Some of them examples are having structured meetings. So having an agenda that's identified for a meeting, having tools to identify who's talking and stopping people from being interrupted in Zoom meetings so people know they'll have a chance to put input. There's a lot of specific tangible examples, many more that I can go into later if it comes up, around fostering culture of belonging. And the last piece I mentioned was that accepting people where they are and meeting them where they are. One of the things that the benefits of working in person is that naturally you end up using different modalities to communicate. Sometimes you present with a PowerPoint, sometimes you present with your words, sometimes you're tactically working on something, sometimes you're intellectually working on something. When you're working remotely, we end up utilizing very few similar repetitive tools that are not necessarily good for certain personalities. So extroverts are great on a Zoom, because an extrovert like me doesn't mind speaking up and interrupting and making sure I get time to talk. But if I'm an introvert, getting centered on a camera screen in front of a group of people, being forced to talk, is not going to support me in sharing my ideas the best way. And so when we're stuck in a remote work environment, we've got to be more creative about putting different modalities, tools, and structures in place to allow these different types of learning and connection. And then the last little thing before I stop, I have no sense of time, Ernie, so thanks.
You're doing great.
We're okay. I'm leaving time for people. Okay, good. Like I said, passionate here. The last piece there is that for me and the company that I'm working with, we found that giving agency back to individuals is very important, and that's very hard to do remotely. And so we're utilizing 3-dimensional spaces, and we're working with companies to do structured programming that's not limited to just team building and fun, but we're working with teams to help them structure meetings, structure feedback, brainstorming sessions, and basically create these connection moments in a 3-dimensional space that give their team members agency again. And what I mean by that is when we're on these 2D forms of connection, or we're only connecting on work, we lose that day-to-day interaction that allows us to organically navigate a space and choose engagement. So if we were in a room, I might gravitate towards Ernie for a few minutes and then gravitate towards Robin. And that choice, the empowerment that just comes from being able to choose where my focus is and who I'm engaging with when, is something that we don't realize that we're missing until we have it again. And so at Morpheus XR, we're trying to leverage 3-dimensional spaces through virtual reality, through desktop applications, to get people back that agency. And we're helping culture makers of companies build structure moments for these connections, whether it be a leadership workshop, a team building experience, or whatnot. So that's my thing for now. And I look forward to jumping in more if relevant.
Thank you, Jen. So
Yeah.
now we're going to switch to our third panelist, Robin Jones, who's CEO of Monsoon, and really coming from the perspective of a company. And I'll let you talk a little more about that, Robin. Why don't you tell us more about yourself and the choices you guys have been making?
Absolutely. So yes, as Ernie said, I'm the CEO of a company here in Portland, Oregon called Monsoon. We are a small business, but with a pretty large global footprint in terms of the customers that we serve, but we do it with a very small team. So I have 6 Portland-based full-time employees, and then I have about 15 offshore contractors that support us in various different roles. And we're a profitable but slow growth company. So I'm not in like crazy hiring mode or anything like that. This is sort of keep the customers happy, keep the employees happy, keep the company profitable kind of mode. And it's about a 20-year-old company, and most of the employees that I have that are in the US have been at the company for at least 7 years. That's an extremely long tenure for a tech company, a software company. And I attribute that, and I've only been the CEO for 2.5 years, so I don't get to take credit for that. I merely maintain and shepherd it. but the culture is one in this small group that has become very, very trusting over the years. It is a mature group of people, meaning I don't think there's a millennial in the bunch. I think we're all in our 40s. And there have become very nice friendships between people. The culture was very much like a lot of water cooler talk, a lot of joking around. There was a lot of onesie twosie going out to get drinks after work kind of relationships happening. And everybody just really trusted that everyone else would do their job. Not politics, and no one trying to sort of step on someone else's back to get ahead. So really lovely place to be a CEO, this culture that I have inherited. But with we had a very nice office right downtown Portland. With the pandemic coming along, we thought on March 6th, I said, okay, there aren't actually stay-at-home orders, but I think since almost all of my employees take public transit to work, we better not be putting people on city buses right now. Let's work from home for a while, thinking it was for a while. And so March 6th, 2020 was our last day in the office. And fast forward just a couple of months, and after George Floyd's murder, we were in the midst of giant unrest in downtown Portland. My office building was 3 blocks from the federal building. That was basically the focal point for all of the protests that happened, which basically made our office not a very safe work environment to get to and from or to be in, really. And so even though we were still staying at home from a COVID perspective, we also started looking at it and going, well, nobody really ought to be going down there anyway. And then we went through a small layoff in September that was sort of COVID related, but partially just because we decided to basically end of life a product effort that we had been working on. So we kind of had all of these things happen basically over the course of, the 6 months in the middle of the year of 2020. And so we had shifted everybody to work from home, kind of thinking that it was going to be temporary. And then it just kept drawing out. And eventually we decided, I spent a bunch of time thinking about this and both navel gazing and speaking to all of my employees, and finally making the decision that we were going to terminate our lease and not go back to the office ever. And so at this point in time, Monsoon is now a fully remote team in 2 time zones that are 12 and a half hours apart, which makes for fun, interesting times of day that we work. But a lot of my work has been, one, in that decision-making process of how to consider whether or not the company culture and the company productivity and the employee retention would survive being a fully remote organization. So there was an element of basically my thinking that went into that. And also a whole host of considerations as the CEO, sort of to what Tony was saying, of like, okay, well, what does this mean for us if now I have people that decide that they want to move back to Iowa because that's where their family is from, and those kinds of things. But then the other part of my role has been, okay, so we are remote and we have been remote for a long time. What do we do to keep this really beautiful culture that we have intact? And so we started out like everybody else did, with a lot of Zoom happy hour, social hour kind of stuff. And very quickly attendance to those things fell off. We were just really, really sick of looking at one another in 2D. And so we basically started shifting some of our activities. And one of the things that I've provided Laura with today that'll get distributed to everyone that's here today is the list of all of the things that we have done for employees over the course of the past year. One thing that's very near and dear to my heart and very important to me as a value is supporting local businesses, and in particular, supporting local BIPOC owned businesses. So one of the things that you'll see is that we started doing care packages, monthly care packages for my employees. Okay, think about this. I was spending a bunch of money on snacks that were in the office and a water service that was in the office and printer ink and coffee and, all of those kinds of things. And I was also spending about $6,000 a month on office space. And all of those costs went away when we got rid of the office. So why not reinvest some of that into things that you can do to lift employee morale? And so we started sending monthly care packages to our team, but we were very selective about where we would get those care packages and gifts from. And we're very active on Slack. So it often ended up spurring a bunch of discussion about the thing that was arrived in the mail or that I went and hand delivered to the employees. So that created some opportunity for connectivity between the team members, but it demonstrated to the employees that their well-being was important to me and to the company. And I was actually kind of surprised at how touched my employees were when we started doing this. I didn't really think that they would see it as sort of going out of my way to try to take care of them, and yet they did. And it's been really a fun thing because now I've kind of opened it up to other members of the team to suggest stuff. So like one of the recent suggestions we got is almost everybody on the team has pets. What if we basically sent home those Chewy boxes to people that have, treats for their dogs or their cats, those kinds of things. So it's been fun to open that up. But what I've provided to Laura is a list of all of the ones, at least that I could remember when I was trying to put the list together, of all the various different things that we've done to support local businesses with our money and the purchases of these care packages, and links to their websites, so that if any of you want to do this within your organizations, you can start with a list of at least a dozen of these things. The other thing that we've done is we've been able to do some virtual and some in-person but outdoor events as well. And so I've listed those for you as well there. But yeah, it's been kind of an interesting journey for us. And I certainly have, a couple of things that I think are my key takeaways or my kind of key lessons for having been through this as advice to someone that is considering going to a full remote. One is that you really need to be very deliberate and have a regular cadence of how you think about and how you drive team connectivity and morale supporting activity within the organization. This can't be an afterthought. It actually ends up being a relatively significant portion of my time as the CEO of the company, to think through what would be a nice thing to do with employees this month. The second thing is that one-on-ones. I know that a lot of organizations do one-on-ones and they kind of, it's like, well, we don't really need to do it because we talk to one another during the company stand-up or some other thing that we've already done. I don't miss a one-on-one anymore. I have been able to get an enormous amount of insight from watching body language, from listening to tone of voice, from asking insightful questions. I always do my one-on-ones with all of my direct reports. And I also prioritize doing monthly one-on-ones with people that don't directly report to me within the company, just so that they recognize that they have a direct line to me if they need it. I pair that with being vulnerable as a leader. COVID's been hard on all of us. It's been hard on me. Like, I've had some days where I just feel like shit, excuse my language, but like there are days where my morale is low. And I think that American society, business society, expects the CEO to be infallible and to be up on a pedestal and not impacted by stuff like this. And it's horseshit. It really is. Like, we are human beings. And for me to be able to actually show that level of vulnerability to my employees and say, I'm having a hard week right now. Like, I'm really having a hard, like, I'm not sleeping well, or, you know, I'm really worrying about X, Y, and Z, or my energy levels are really low. It allows them to open up to me. And just being able to talk about it and know that they're being seen for it has made an enormous difference. During our reviews this year, almost every single one of my employees said to me that they really appreciated that about me, my behavior towards them, but that they also felt very supported. And then lastly, I almost push people out the door to take mental health days and to take vacations. Vacation's been really tough the past year and a half, 2 years, because people don't take a chunk of time off work if you're not going to get on a plane or get in a car and drive somewhere. Nobody's taking a week or two at a time off. But I don't know about you, but a 4-day weekend isn't enough for me to actually unwind from what is going on at work. Like, it's not enough time to calm the busy mind. And so I have been quite insistent that my employees actually take their PTO, and we have a take it as you need it PTO policy. So I don't have a finite number of days that someone gets every year at Monsoon. And so, and generally speaking, people tend to take less. It's totally counterintuitive. People tend to take less vacation days when they have a take it when you need it policy. So I kind of try to force them to recognize that they need it. So I think those are the big chunks of advice that I would give to anyone else that's in a similar role or considering taking their organizations fully remote.
Thank you, Robin. Well, let's start trying to weave some of these various topics together. And one of the things that I think, Tony, you might be able to address is, again, how do benefits and leave, maybe this is a segue to what Robin was just talking about, is, again, you've got people who have had a hard time taking even breaks during the day or taking time off, but you've got employer obligations for that. How's that transition working with a lot of people?
Poorly is how it's working. I think there's two elements to that. One is one of the really challenging issues from a legal perspective and from a business perspective is paid time off and unpaid time off, actually, too, from a business perspective. But there's a huge amount of regulations because there's been a reluctance to provide paid time off or provide very much time off for employees. Kind of historically, that's been part of our culture. And what that's really led to, in my belief, is a lot of presenteeism. So you have somebody there, but they're really tuned out. They're not really there, which is actually more costly in a lot of ways than having somebody gone and then productive when they are there. And so I think presenteeism is really, when we talk about virtual schools, that is the failure of virtual schools right now. And so we need to look at, okay, how does our paid time off really create a situation where people are present during their non-paid time off? And also, how does it comply with the laws? Because the laws are so complicated because employers didn't want to give people time off when they really needed time off. So we've got a whole bunch of laws that give people sick time and a certain amount of sick time. And there's a lot of complicated rules about how you calculate the sick time and how you measure the sick time. And then we've got FMLA leaves, and we've got California Family Rights Act, or Washington Family Rights Act, or Oregon Family Rights Act. We've got all these different types of leave laws. And we need to develop in each organization a way to bring these things together so it's a workable time off solution. Because otherwise you end up putting it into an employee handbook that's like this much leave, and you can't even figure out where your leave really belongs and what bucket you fall in and what the procedures are. So one of the things I am seeing a lot of employers moving toward, particularly employers with a lot of professional workforce that are very engaged individuals who have a kind of a career trajectory, I can't say the word.
Trajectory,
yeah. Is going toward a PTO structure that is basically unlimited. And in order to do that, you really need to be able to establish what is meeting expectations so that you can take that time off, and how are you going to sustain your workplace operations when people take time off. And those are the two big hurdles. And if you can do that, then you have the advantage of, it's not a specific bucket where people feel like they have to take it. They feel like they have some, there's a confidence in their ability to manage that aspect of their life, that work-life balance, which is empowering and which creates usually better decision-making. So that's one thing I've seen a trend for, but it doesn't work in all workplace situations. I mean, you need to have a group of committed employees for that to be a realistic option. And if it's not, then you really need to look at what type of paid time off do you want to give? And how are you going to meet all the state and local mandates and the federal mandates when you're giving it to them? And that takes planning and a lot of planning. But fortunately, there's a lot of services that have come available that have integrated paid time off policies and can provide some help. And there's some online resources that will give you kind of the skinny, the Cliff Note version of what the laws are in each location. And so I think if you're going to take one takeaway, is dealing with, okay, how do we have a universal paid time off policy that meets our principles, gives people the time off they need, and meets the legal requirements, and invest in that, because it is crucial. Beyond that, employee benefits are increasingly important. And that's my background and that's my history. So it's near and dear to my heart, but people are recognizing the value of it more, because most employee benefits are designed for your worst case scenario, which most people when they're in their 20s think, oh, there's no worst case scenario. For me, that's what happens to other people. Well, the pandemic has really let us know that worst case scenario can happen to anybody, and people are valuing employee benefits a lot more than they have been. And so we've seen an expansion of employee benefits in the workplace, and even something as simple as pet insurance, which isn't very traditional, but it can address a lot of stress in the workplace, because instead of having to worry, oh, you've got a sick pet that you're sitting here looking at home and you can't afford care, you've got you've got some background, you've got some support. And the same, that's true with medical care. And it's really true for employee assistance plans. That's been one of my focus with employers is even if you're a small employer, think about putting an EAP in place because they can be an invaluable resource. They're underutilized. So when one of companies that have it don't have people actually using it very much because they don't understand the value there. But once they understand the value, I think that that's really useful. And so anything like that, like employee benefits that you're offering, one of the key things is having the employees understand what you're giving them and where it can help them and having them utilize it. And in a remote workplace, we have online tools that help with that, but we come back to we relied for so many years on in-person meetings and one-on-one, and now we've got to find another way to reach out and make sure people understand what we're providing them and how to use it. And so that's where the more different types of touch you can have, the more likely you are to reach different people. Relying on one mode usually doesn't work. Somebody falls through the cracks if you do that. And so that kind of brings us back to what Jennifer was talking about is how do you reach everybody? How do you make sure that nobody's left out?
Thank you, Tony. It's an interesting because what I'm seeing here is that we've got some interesting approaches. Robin with our care packages. So you have to be very diligent about thinking about those things. But then, okay, you've got to have people take time off. How do we keep these employees engaged and keep building that team? And maybe I'll kick this over to you, Jen, and you can talk a little more about some of those ways that people do some of that team building and how do they keep people involved. And I suppose that's also helping them at least not be so stressed out about work. It's sort of like little mini taking days off or time off as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I think one of the things that has to be said about culture is that culture exists. The question is, was it an intentional culture that you shaped with your vision, or was it a culture that existed in the absence of your intentional leadership? And so that's, there is a culture. The culture is, do people, can you trust people to work independently? Well, what is it about a culture of independent working? So basically our roles as leaders is to define the culture we want. And I think so many people were relying on these structures before. They never had to face that question, but now you're ultimately getting to build the structure all over again. You're getting to reset. And so we get to look at the opportunity in that. If you haven't taken time yet to be intentional, now's the time to be intentional. What I heard very loud and clear and what Robin said was that she had to make a choice as a leader about what the quality of the culture she was building would be. And it sounded like she chose for it to be a quality where individuals were seen as whole people. So it was okay to be a whole person who needed time. And I would advocate for that. So I would say anyone on this call, I'm a very strong believer. Yes, we should advocate for whole viewpoint perspective, that humans are whole people and not just our worker bees. But there are some people who don't want their employees to really be seen personally for whatever reason, their product or their service, they prefer more anonymous, more anonymized input. And so that's another topic. With that said, how do we include and how do we accommodate in really truly inclusive engagement? The first thing I'd say, this is going to sound really simple, but I really would love everyone on board. If you want to raise your hands after I say this, I would encourage you to raise your hands. But don't plan one single event that is predicated on excluding anyone. And what I mean by that is sometimes there are things that you want to do as a team, but let's say you happen to have a member of your team who is blind and you have been successfully able to find work for that blind person to do. And that's like a very rough and rare example, but then that means you are no longer allowed to do a team building experience that's going to see a movie that does not have the tools to support blind people enjoying that movie experience. You can never do that. It is no longer acceptable for you. And even if, oh, well, that person's on vacation. It's like, well, no, if their vacation plans got canceled and they were all of a sudden available, you don't want to have a team event that would exclude them. That's an extreme example, but people do that all the time when their colleagues are out on leave, or if you learn that a colleague doesn't like horror movies, right? And you want to do a horror movie watch party for your holiday gathering, but you have a colleague who literally cannot watch horror movies, then you just agree that as a culture, you're not going to do a group event that makes that event the prioritized activity. It's a compromise we make so that way everyone feels included. That doesn't mean you can't go with one colleague to see a horror movie or do a personal watch party of a horror movie, but that it's such a simple choice to make sure once you've learned about these qualities of your people, you accommodate for those qualities in all that we do. And specifically, I'm a big advocate of taking this time, especially since I think companies who meet in person should do this too, but I think it's really valuable for companies to invest in character leadership training, where they learn about their leadership qualities and character traits of their managers and teams, and introduce that as a common conversation where people can actually have tools to communicate their needs to each other that go beyond personalized tools. So you can easily arrange for your team to do a leadership traits workshop where you learn, oh, well, I tend to like direct communication. I prefer indirect communication. And you start to give each other tools to communicate your styles and preferences and make it acceptable to have those be known and to have it be okay that individuals have different preferences, and start to incorporate that into your meetings. So for team building, Ernie, you would ask the question of, well, what's some of the fun team building things we can do? One of the biggest things you can do is take one of your regular scheduled meetings and put a twist on that. So everyone wants to find a quick fix, like let's go to an escape room, or let's do a scavenger hunt. Let's do something super fun. But I think, Robin, you said it wonderfully, which is it can't be just a tack on at the end. It can't be just a one flash in the pan. You would have more effectiveness if you decided to start every Monday meeting with what was your favorite, with a random question. And if every time you guys met, you say, okay, what's your favorite movie? What's your favorite color? And you just got in a rhythm where at least one of your standing monthly or weekly meetings, a portion of it was dedicated to a prompt and a way for people to express themselves. Robin, you have something to share?
Every Friday. So every Friday,
Right.
I do it by Slack, but we do it every Friday. And I have the longest list of questions. So again, if people need a list of questions, but it's like, if someone was making a movie about you, what actor or actress would play your role? Or, what's the best gift you ever received? And it's just a Slack prompt. People can answer it or choose not to, but it has inspired a lot of conversation among team members and learning things about your team members that you didn't know. And it's not that hard to do. There's a zillion of these questions for conversation. Look, just Google conversation starter questions and you'll get a giant list of them.
And the thing that we're doing at Morpheus is we're working with teams to bring in their all hands or their offsites into virtual reality. So this is what a virtual reality headset looks like. It's new, it's exciting. You can ask me questions about it later. But so we're working with teams to do their monthly all hands and have it where everyone works together on a presentation and gets to go into a virtual physical space. And we do a little bit of a presentation on a big screen, which is like an IMAX screen where you can fly your avatar up and point to what you're talking about. And then after that, we do some interactive games. So we are actually trying to capture what it was like to be in person, but incorporating, imagine what it would be like in person to start a meeting where you toss a ball to each other and say, hey, how are you doing? I'm going to toss the ball to who I'm talking to. We're less likely to do that in corporate meetings because how often do we equip our conference rooms with basketballs to toss around and feel safe doing that? In virtual reality, we're able to do that together, right? We're able to bring in some of those physical, playful elements into regular meetings. And I think those simple actions are things we can all do on this call without having to have a big budget, without having to, have extra budget for this stuff. And then if you can combine those with a quarterly or an annual fun event, well, then that would be the sweet spot because people do like to just let loose and have fun together. So I'm not trying to knock on anybody who has a really great fun event that they do. I'm just saying, don't knock bringing the fun to the regular meetings.
Thanks, Jen. We're about 10 minutes before 1, so we still have a fair amount of time, but I thought I'd at least kick it out to the audience again. And if there are particular issues you want us to cover in the next 20 minutes, maybe now's a perfect time for a question. Otherwise, we can keep having the panel, discuss various issues. Do we have any questions at this point? Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, I think one One question that has popped up in my conversations with people is onboarding. Like when you have, especially a fully remote workforce, how do you onboard those people? Because it used to be, right? You go to the office and they get to hang out at the water cooler, or they go to lunch with someone. And so part of the onboarding was just getting to know the people in the office, as well as whatever technology or processes they need to learn. So are there any comments about what's a great way in this new work environment to bring people on board?
Well, Robin, let's start with you. Yeah.
I haven't done it yet. We haven't hired anybody in this time frame where we've been fully remote, but I can tell you what I would do. So I think the first thing that I would do is make sure that sometime during that new employee's first week that we did some form of all hands team building type activity. So an example of one that we did relatively recently is there's a service out of San Francisco Bay Area called Tiny Bee Chocolates. And it is basically a truffle making kit that they send to your house. And then you have an instructor that sort of talks you through things, and they do some fun activities where you actually have a competition and you make funny combinations of things. And so it was just this nice group of us on Zoom. We did this as a team building exercise internally, not with a new employee, but a group exercise where we get to kind of talk about what we've done and listen to some music and those kinds of things. So I would definitely make sure that during week one, you schedule something like that, where they just get a sense of how the team members interact with one another, and the opportunity for the team members to be able to get to know this new employee a bit. The other thing I would do is what I always do anyway for onboarding a new employee is that before they come on board, I create an entire schedule for them that usually books out basically their first 3 days worth of work. So it is, sitting with somebody to help them get all of their IT stuff set up. That's usually one of the first things. But then it is, okay, these are all the people within the company that you need to know in order to do your job. I have those meetings scheduled for them in advance, and I have told both the new employee and the employee that they are going to be meeting with what their agenda is for their meeting. These are the topics I need you guys to talk about. You can talk about other stuff too, but my objective for this meeting between these two people is to cover XYZ material. So by the end of that 3-day period, the new employee knows all of the people that are the go-to for various different things where they know they're going to get stuck, and they've built personal relationships. There is no reason that you can't do that via Zoom or virtual reality. And I would highly recommend it, even if you're doing it in person. So I think those would be my pieces of advice on that front.
Great, thanks. Appreciate it. I got a couple people. Go ahead. Tony, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I think onboarding, the virtual environment for onboarding has created is a need for us to be more definite about our onboarding processes and paperwork, because a lot of times before COVID and when we were in person, you would just go in and somebody would kind of show you the ropes, and nothing was really written down, nothing was formulated. And as Robin said, having a structure is really important for somebody who's coming on, because it's really, even if you're just following somebody around, it's disconcerting, particularly if it's your first day on the job. It's a lot of information. It's people you're not that familiar with. There's a lot of people, and you feel like you're being judged because you want to prove yourself. And I think that we should look at the onboarding processes in a virtual scenario as a real opportunity to make our onboarding more streamlined, focus on those legal things that really need to be understood and that need to be put in place, and also focus on easing people into the job and getting them some amount of recognition for the parts that they do well, and some actual collaborative working instead of just a dump of information and having them kind of trail somebody, because everything works better when it's interactive. And that's one way that we can use modern technology and also the actual work to focus the onboarding process. And from a lawyer's perspective, I really want onboarding to go well, because that's where you set the expectations for the employment relationship. That's where you, the onboarding process can be a failure for what would otherwise be a really good employment relationship. And so I think that it's a really important question, and one that should consume some of our time and planning.
Absolutely. Thanks. I appreciate that. And I want to, I see Bruce Coleman's raised his hand a couple of times. I read his question in the in Q&A, but let me certainly address or ask the question, and that is, we have multiple folks representing economic development. Various cities in Washington County are on the call. And what can local government do to support the growth of a remote workforce? Because I think economic development in general, they're judged on like, how many jobs did you add into the area, right? But if it's remote, maybe that's not the right metric. But are there things or any suggestions for local governments that they can do to help this hybrid or remote workforce?
I have a few thoughts on this. So number one, during the time frame of the early part of the pandemic, I had an employee who he was working full time. His wife was working full time. They had 3 small children, 2 of which were twins that were not yet of school age. And they both were trying to work from home. And one of the things that we did for this employee is we basically said, look, no one else is using our office, so you're in there by yourself. It would be safe for you to be there by yourself, assuming that you're not leaving when the riots start, right? But we basically allowed for that. Now that's not gonna happen anymore. If I was to hire a new person that was in that same situation, I can't provide them that resource. I believe that there's an opportunity for potentially reconfiguring some of the co-working spaces so that they are more sanitized, isolated spaces, so that that could be provided to people that are working remotely, but just can't functionally do it within their own homes. So that's number one. The second thing is, I talked a lot about how when I started doing these care packages and looking for activities to do with my team, I was looking to support local businesses, because that's a personal value of mine, and aligns well with the personal values of my employees as well. I had to do so much dang research to try to find things that I could do. The people that are in these cities know who their small businesses are and who have services, who have activities, who have appropriate event venues, who have products that would be right for this. I think, like I just did to provide to all of you, just write down all of these things on a list and make it available. Why couldn't each one of the cities or economic development commissions do that within their thing? So it may not be creating a new job for me at Monsoon, but it might be creating a new job for the person that runs the chocolate workshops, for example. So that's, I think, another thing that might not be obvious, but I spent more dang time figuring that out. When Tony was speaking about this just unbelievable laundry list of things that a CEO needs to think about if they're going to have employees that are in different cities and states, oh my God, like that just was practically giving me a panic attack thinking about that, right? If there was a resource that was available to the CEOs and the CFOs and the COOs of the companies that reside within your city to give them some guidelines for, you know, if you want to employ somebody in Forest Grove versus in Portland, these are the differences that you're going to have. Or if you want to employ somebody that's in California versus in Portland, these are the things that you need to consider. So I think it would be nice to be able to, as a business leader, to have a cheat sheet that gives me enough information to be dangerous. And then I know to what, like, some basic guidelines or parameters around what I am and am not, what pain I'm willing to take and what pain I'm not willing to take to support remote workers in different locations. And then I call Tony and say, okay, here's what I want to do, right? Right. So I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I really think that locations can use this. Like if you had, and some actual cities have this, and they have a web page that says, if you want to hire a worker who's going to work here, what do you need to do? And they have a checklist of different things to do, and they have links to other agencies that have regulatory authority. And so you can just follow that checklist, and you know that you can employ somebody. When I had my own firm, I had a remote worker in Port Angeles, Washington, and it was a California firm. But I was able to link into a website and figure out exactly what paperwork I needed to file in order to have that legitimate. And that was because the Washington State website was well set up. And so having that information readily available decreases the stress level. I mean, it's not like there's not things that still have to be worked out, but at least you can entertain that idea without having to hire a lawyer and spend a bunch of money before you even interview somebody. It really makes a difference. And particularly if you have remote workers already in a location and you can get some idea to quantify it, you can even have a page that says, we're happy to have X% of our population remote working in some capacity or another, something like that, that says the jurisdiction is hospitable to it and receptive to it, because some jurisdictions just aren't. And having that clear is an attractant, or at least I would find it as an attractant as an employer.
Tony, can I ask you a related question to what you were just talking about? Because it was something that popped up when I was thinking about this. So let's just pick a hypothetical. So for example, if I was not an employer in Portland and I was running like a service business, right? So I was employing people that potentially are minimum wage employees, right? But could work remotely, right? Are there reasons? So for example, I might want to exclude Portland because of the minimum wage. That's not me, but an hypothetical, I know there are people that would think that way. Are there ways that would be, I guess, legitimately legal to exclude candidates that have applied from places that are not favorable in terms of employment law for the company? Because certainly there are states and cities that have laws in place that are much more favorable to the employee than to the corporation. And I wonder, can you be an equal opportunity employer and also say, but I don't want anybody from Portland, right?
Well, I think that you wouldn't want to say you don't want anybody from Portland, but you could say certainly you have to have a work location that's within this parameter. I don't think that you have to open, there's no laws that say you have to accept everybody from any location. And I think that there would be exceptions if somebody had to be in a certain location because they had a medical condition and they couldn't be in certain, like they needed to be close to a major hospital or something like that. I mean, I can imagine situations where you'd have a protected classification. But there's no protected classification for where you work. You could also establish a remote workplace location, maybe through, I know that there's a lot of organizations that kind of rent office space of some type on a limited basis. And you could establish, even if they were resident in a location, you could establish an office location that wasn't in that location. It would probably have some expense associated with it, but that might be another way to do it.
And that actually kind of connects to what I would answer to Bruce's question in terms of resources. I think the big thing, as Robin mentioned, I'm constantly shocked as I've worked on different corporate clients, how there are a lot of general resources out there that you can find, but to find resources that work for your use case are very difficult. And what I mean by that specifically is there's a lot of great diversity and inclusion training that's online right now. There's a lot of great culture allyship training that's online, but it's being provided on this very high level. And if you do have companies and people in your network like Robin who are willing to provide resources or share, having a resource page where people who can say, I'm a software company and we found this training to work for us that it's not just about resources, but specifically about resources by category or use group, especially if you know which particular types of businesses are thriving or centralized in your area. But I can tell you for sure that training resources and free training, there are a lot of great leaders who really want to set an intentional culture of inclusion and a culture of belonging, and they just need a few resources. Those resources are available, but it'd be great for them to be able to go to your site where they're already going for other key information, like the conversation Rob and Tony are having.
Yeah, I agree with all these comments, and it's also an issue just in terms of working with entrepreneurs, because there are a lot of resources out there in the ecosystem, but it's almost overwhelming. It's like, what are the right resources at the right time for what I need? And I really love these comments because I think it's great insights for a lot of these municipalities that are listening in, to also, you know, join the charge, so to speak, and provide some of those resources and make it easier to do business in their town. And then you're more likely to stay. You feel welcome, you have easy access to resources. I think that definitely helps. So thank you all for answering that question. Ernie, did you have another one?
I didn't. I was just thinking, listening to the conversation, and actually it raises an issue in my mind. Is that, you know, again, from a city perspective, is that, again, if you really want to grow, you know, employment in your area, then why not take the approach of, let's make it easy that we can have remote workers in our area, and try to think about how we make life easier for those remote workers, because we actually could expand the people that are living in our community by that fact alone, because now they don't have to commute somewhere. They can live in our local community and just work remotely.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of employers are starting to think that way too, because again, even as lawyers, I'm commuting less to the office every day. And so again, where I live becomes more important. About my work and home life are more intersected. Anyway, so it's just an interesting concept, I think.
Yeah, and I think Robin brought this up just in terms of the co-working spaces, because I just had coffee with somebody on Tuesday, and he had a similar situation as the employee you mentioned, Robin. He has 2 little kids at home. So, you know, he goes, I actually like going to an office where I can be focused. I mean, it's hard because they're knocking on the door. Hey, Dad, can you come out and play? Or something like that. So I think being able to accommodate people, you know, who have different situations, or some people, you know, when it's 95 degrees outside and they don't have AC at home, it's another reason they might like to go into the office just to kind of get a break from it all. So to me, like some of the key words that I heard today were being intentional about your culture, intentional in terms of reaching out to your employees, and all of this, where there's legal issues, you know, employee issues, culture. It's so important to be intentional. And the other word that resonates with me is just flexibility, and you know, putting policies in place, but also having solutions in place that enable, you know, things to be a little bit more flexible. And happy employees tend to be more loyal employees that will stick around, because the other issue around this remote workforce is people are moving around a fair amount. So how do you retain people? And I think there are a lot of good suggestions here today about what can be done to retain your employees as well. So, well, with that, I don't think we have any more questions, any last comments that people want to make. We'll just go around the horn. Maybe Tony, start with you, and then we'll do Jen and Robin.
Sure. I guess taking off my lawyer hat for a moment, I'll put in my 2 cents about retaining people, and I will share my experience as an employee at a very, very large firm that really, there were a lot of negatives about the firm and the culture. But one of the things that they said and they lived is that they hire people for life, and life has a lot of changes and a lot of unexpected parts. And so when you hire somebody, you don't hire them, you hire them in that moment, and things look very different in that moment than they're probably going to look 5-10 years from now. And having that idea that you're hiring somebody for life and they're people who things change makes a big difference. And the other thing that this employer did is the managers had regular touch with you, not touching, because there's laws against that. But they made regular telephone calls or regular emails, and it wasn't I'm checking in on you in a pejorative sense. It was like, I'm checking in on you to see how you're doing and what I can do to support you, and if things are okay with your kids, and knowing something personally about me and the things I was going through. And I got a call from the managing partner when my mother was going through a hard time, because I had talked to him in the hallway, and he followed up to find out how that was going and if there were resources that we could have to help. And it's that type of one-on-one caring from managers that really makes most people stay at their job. And that means somebody actually listening to the employees. And one of the things I love about the virtual workplace is, I'm in my 50s and I don't catch balls all that well anymore, but in the virtual workplace, I can do all those things. And the virtual workplace also makes it a little easier to have that kind of one-on-one, because it doesn't take a whole commitment to go out to coffee or go to dinner. It can be a telephone call, it can be a quicker interaction, and everybody comes on an equal playing field. But it means that the managers need to be intentional about it. So we get back to being very intentional about engaging and listening and just caring. And having that come through, not just based on one-on-one chemistry of being in person. So it's kind of like we've all become slightly autistic, and now we need to think a little bit more about how we communicate. And I think that's a good thing. I think it creates inclusion for a lot of people, but we have to look at it that way. It's a change for a lot of us. And I think it's a change that we're going to find out is a good change, not a negative.
I love that, because that was some of the comments I've heard. They want to know that the people really care about them as humans, not just as an employee, but they really care about them. So thanks for that comment, Jen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I really appreciate where you're going there. And what I want to build on is that we have a whole new workforce of eligible employees in the remote world. There are people who were not comfortable going into work and who were limited by distance and geography. And now you don't have the geographic distance. But we do still need to use metrics when we're recruiting and hiring. Those of you that have studied how to make sure that we're not using biased recruitment methods, we have to define objectively what we're hiring for and define some of these subjective qualities like culture. So I've talked a lot about being intentional, but when you say something's a culture fit, what does it mean to be a culture fit for your culture? Like, define, if your organization hasn't revisited their values since COVID, now's a great time to revisit your value statement. What are your values? And are your values, what's the deeper level there? And can you bring those values into everything you do? And I mean that very literally. Can you take your values and make them cornerstones of a prompt in your meetings? Can you take your values and come up with give the families and your coworkers a poster contest, whose kids or whose extended family can draw the best new logo for your company, a playful logo. Like, there's ways to take your value statements and breathe life into them as team engagement activities. And if you don't have one, it's a great time to think about it, because being in relationship with each other, both about the value we each intrinsically bring and the value our goal, the value we're trying to create together, is a great place to inspire people to get out of their own way and kind of create something bigger than themselves. And specifically in doing that with hiring and recruitment, setting a goal of the qualities, defining that together with your team, and then doing yourself a favor and maybe have them meet you in a virtual reality world where you can't see their face, but you can only hear their voice and you can only hear what their answers are, and give yourself the benefit of playing with some of these tools so you can access talent that you didn't even know or you weren't looking at when you were doing it the old IRL way. So that's what I would inspire in this moment. Pass it to Robin.
I have a recruitment method that I have documented that is specifically based on recruiting around your company's core values. I can share that document with you, Laura, and you can send it out to everybody as well. And you can take it for what it's worth, but it's worked really well for me in terms of just recruiting people that align very well with the corporate culture that we're intentionally looking to build. In terms of my takeaways, as a leader of a company, as a leader of a team, your job is no longer just about hitting company objectives, hitting team objectives. It's not. It is just as much effort needs to be put into creating opportunities for inclusion, connection, morale building, team building. It is more important than it's ever been, and you have to be intentional about it. And I'll just leave it at that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Ernie, and thank you, stellar panel. This was just a fantastic conversation, and I really appreciate your time and appreciate everyone on the call this morning joining us. So take care. I'll get Robin mentioned a bunch of notes that she passed along to me. So I'll get that out to everybody that signed up, and I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day.